Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Mets Daily on the Fan Arch Network. John Saponaro here with you today and every day to talk about our New York Mets. But of course, before we get started, a quick shout out goes to our friends over at Kalshi for sponsoring the video for a limited time. Use the code FANARCHBASEBALL on the Kalshi app to get $10 when you trade 10. Well, the song remains the same. Another game, another start to a homestand or road trip in this case, and another loss for the New York Mets. Even at this point, when we take the positives, when we try to glean the positives, like I talked about in yesterday's show, and there were some positives in this defeat as well, it does end up with another defeat. And that's why the big picture of this season, regardless of math, regardless of hope, regardless of science, regardless of fact or opinion, the season is over for the New York Mets because they're at a point where if you look to 2027, as I have now started to do, and as I encourage you to do, there are positives. There are silver linings. There are things that we can talk about that's not just win column, loss column. But yesterday's game is another representation of why this season is over, because there are no moral victories if all you're trying to do is crawl out of the grave that you dug for yourself. But if you resign to the fact that this is over and now you can look forward, well then sure, in a 2-1 defeat at the hands of the Toronto Blue Jays, you could take some positives away. And we'll talk about some of them. But this is a Toronto team that very similar to the New York Mets in terms of expectation, very similar to the New York Mets in terms of what has gone wrong so far, with their offense being non-existent, with their stars in some cases not living up to the billing. It's a little different when you're Vladimir Guerrero Jr. and you've been there in Toronto for a long time. And yeah, he got the big contract and all that stuff, but he's also provided in that lineup for that city and stayed. So if he hits a little bit of a skid and he has a down year, and this by all accounts is a down year for him, it's going to be very difficult for him to catch up on some of those numbers, sitting at 4 home runs on June 30th. And no home runs in the Sky Dome in Toronto or the Rogers Center, whatever. It's going to be hard for him to catch up. So this is a down year. But you can weather the storm of a down year when you're not in a market like New York, and you can weather the storm of a down year when you're a guy who has already provided so much for that franchise. And that's a big part of the difference in what a lot of Mets fans see in a guy like Bo Bichette to keep that Toronto theme going. But the bottom line is, in this game, Toronto, who came into this game losers of 6 in a row and being swept in a 4-game series by the Texas Rangers, they used the New York Mets to get right. And they do, in fact, get right. They get the victory. And for the Mets, it's their 3rd straight loss in a 1-run game. And it's just the way things have been for this team. You know, earlier in the season, earlier in the month, I tried to push to you guys teams that the Mets should beat, teams that the Mets are better than on paper. We're at the point now where paper doesn't matter. And we're at the point now where the Mets aren't really better than anyone. The Mets became, with this loss, the 3rd team in Major League Baseball to reach 50 losses behind, I believe it's the Rockies and the Royals. They each got there first. So when you look at the rest of Major League Baseball, the other 27 teams not named the Mets, Rockies, or Royals, it's not a lot of teams that the Mets should beat. Hell, even the Rockies took care of business against the Mets in Citi Field. So, you know, when you look at this game and when you compare it to what I said yesterday on yesterday's show or 2 days ago, this wouldn't surprise me. Any outcome for this series wouldn't surprise me. And the Mets could have won this game, maybe should have won this game, but they didn't. As for tonight's game, maybe more of the same. As for tomorrow's game, maybe more of the same. If the Mets win the next two and win the series, I wouldn't be shocked. If the Mets get swept, I wouldn't be shocked. Sean Manaea in this game is okay. Sean Manaea goes 5 1/3, 3 hits, 2 earned runs, although one of those earned runs is a little suspect. We'll talk about that in a second. 2 walks, 4 Ks. And the issue is the errors doomed him. Much like the errors doomed Freddie Peralta in his last go-around, the errors doomed Manaea here, who deserved a little bit better than what he got. I mean, the game starts off in embarrassing fashion with the Little League home run in the bottom of the first for George Springer. And it's ruled a triple and an error that leads to the score. But I think that play, watching it again, I really think that's a single and 2 errors. And, that ball got by Soto. He was trying to make a play. He was over-aggressive. He tried to play the short hop, couldn't do it. It skips by him. And then, of course, the error does get charged to Ewing for trying to pick up the ball, and it just kind of goes flying out of his glove as he's trying to make a quick transfer. But I think there's 2 errors on that play. They ruled it a triple. They're probably going to keep it a triple and an error. But that didn't do Manaea any favors, obviously, right out of the gate. And then later on, in the final inning, in the 6th, Lindor makes an error. Little uncharacteristic. Looks like his timing is off. It doesn't look like Lindor's feet are under him 100% yet, although he did get the home run later. And, I think Lindor's one of those guys. Lindor's going to be fine. If you're worried about Lindor, you're placing your worry in the wrong place. But Lindor makes an error that quite literally leads to Sean Manaea leaving the game. He was sitting somewhere around 80-ish pitches, mid-80s. Looked like he was going to be able to finish that 6th inning, even though the Mets were down. And then that error kind of just opens things up where now he's throwing more pitches. Now the Mets have to go to the bullpen, and the Mets manage to narrowly escape without giving up another run in that spot. But the error there was costly in terms of, confidence, in terms of Sean Manaea's individual numbers. Sean Manaea lowered his ERA with this performance to like 4.7 something. It doesn't matter, but it's just frustrating to see those things happen in a season like this. Again, where we're trying to find some things where you say, wow, hey, the Mets had a really good blank today, or the Mets turned in a really good performance in this way. It sucks when one part of the game sours another part. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Sean Manaea's numbers and you look at how Sean Manaea pitched and how Sean Manaea navigated this lineup, that's a positive. But if you look at him not being able to qualify for a win because of a bad play in the outfield, 2 bad plays, and then you look at him not being able to get 6 innings, which it looked like he was going to do kind of automatically because of another bad play in the field, it just kind of sours on those positive notes that you're trying to find. Yasavage wasn't great, but he was good enough. 6 2/3, 3 hits, 1 run, no walks, 3 Ks. He wasn't fooling anybody. He pitched well, but he was not fooling anyone. Neither was Manaea in some cases, but that brings me to our second topic, which is the exit velocity in this game was absolutely insane. Like off the charts, crazy good. The Mets, the Blue Jays, but specifically the Mets and Vladimir Guerrero Jr. for the Jays were hammering baseballs. And credit to Gary and Ron. They both made mention of this several times on the broadcast. If you watch the TV broadcast, it was a big topic of conversation. I didn't get a chance to listen to any of this game on the radio, so I don't know if Keith brought it up at all. Keith Rad, that is, or Pat on the radio broadcast. I don't know. I'm sure they did. They're very astute, and also they've got great people giving them information like this. I know some people don't like exit velocity. If you're a more old school fan, you think exit velocity is the problem in the sport or one of the biggest problems in the sport. I'm not here to talk about that or debate the merits of that today. Maybe at some point in the future we could have that conversation. But the bottom line is this. If you hit the ball harder, generally speaking, that is going to be better, right? Hit the ball harder. there's more of a chance of that ball traveling further. There's more of a chance of that ball, even if it's on the ground, getting through the infield or being misplayed by a fielder. Hitting the ball harder is better. And this game, with as many hard hit balls that were flying around for both sides, you would have thought this game would have finished 8-7, 11-10. Hell, even maybe more than that, 15-12. If a couple men are on base and some of those balls leave the yard or some of those balls go for extra bases. But that was not the case. This game ended 2-1. And if you look at the metric on how odd this is, anything over anything over 95 miles an hour in terms of exit velocity is considered hard hit. There were 20 balls hit over 95 miles an hour in this game. 20. The Mets, because of course they did. You know where I'm going with this. You're a Mets fan. The Mets had 13 of them. So the Mets had the vast majority of them. Yeah, the Jays got their licks in. They had 7. 7 balls over 95 is good. Vladimir Guerrero accounted for 2 of them that were well over 100 miles an hour for outs. We'll talk about him in a second. But the Mets had 13 balls hit at 95 miles an hour or more. One of them was Lindor's home run. That accounted for the entirety of the Mets' runs. But Bichette had some, and Benj, and Soto, and all over the lineup. The Mets are squaring up balls with basically nothing to show for it. And I thought one of the craziest things in this game was that there were 2 outs recorded in this game on balls hit over 111 miles per hour. That is insane. And both of those outs weren't even spectacular plays. You're not talking about like a diving play, do or die chance by an infielder on a ball roped down the line. Or, this unbelievable leaping catch by an outfielder. And there were some really good rangy plays in the outfield. But it wasn't one of those. They were just line drives essentially roped right at people. One of them was off the bat of Brett Beatty, of all people. And the other one was off the bat of Vlad Guerrero Jr. And like I said, he had 2 outs over 100 miles an hour. I think his other out that he lined into was 109 miles an hour. So he was ripping balls all over the ballpark and did not have a tremendous amount to show for it. And that's kind of been indicative of Vladimir Guerrero Jr.'s season to this point and why the under the hood numbers and the bat speed and the hard hit rate are all right where they need to be, but the expected batting average doesn't line up with the actual batting average and the power numbers are down or whatever. Anyway, we're not here to talk about Vlad Guerrero Jr. It's not a Blue Jays show, but I just find it remarkable that you could have a game with 20, I'll say it again, 20 balls hit over 95 miles an hour and have that game end 2-1. Baseball season is here, and now you can trade every game on Kalshi. You guys know what I do. Before I sit down, I hit that record button. I head on over to the Kalshi app. I go on Kalshi.com, and I see what value you might be able to find. And I was kind of going back and forth on this one. There were some things I liked, some things I didn't like so much. Nothing I loved, so I had to be, in an effort to be creative, as I'm trying to do, I had to pick something that I like but I don't love. And that is over 3.5 runs in this game coming up later on tonight. Now, if you've been on the Kalshi app, you're on Kalshi.com, there is a slider for over-under. So I went with 3.5 because I like the value at 3.5 runs. If you think there will not be over 3.5 runs, that's trading at 13 cents. That means that $100 will get you roughly $725. Now, the odds of another game like the one we just saw happening seem like they wouldn't be great. We just saw a game where 3 runs are scored. However, these are 2 teams that have had weird and bad offensive seasons. And now you've got two pitchers going tonight in Nolan McLean and Kevin Gausman, who, despite some of their struggles, can really stand a lineup on their head at any given moment. And what I like about McLean is that this is the first time he is facing Toronto. So pretty much nobody in this lineup, because he only had 8 starts last season, and he didn't face them, and now he's facing this team for the first time, pretty much nobody in this lineup has ever seen him before. And we know how nasty Nolan McLean can be when people don't know about the spin. The scouting report's going to be there. You could read about the spin, but you don't know about the spin until you stand in the box and see the spin. So I think we could see a performance from McLean tonight that is reminiscent of what he did last season in those 8 starts when he bursted on the scene and nobody knew about Nolan McLean. So I think he has the potential to shut down this Jays lineup to the tune of 7 shutout innings, something like that. And then on the other side, you got Kevin Gausman. And Kevin Gausman was great for a while. Kevin Gausman was famously almost a Met, decided he didn't want to be in New York. But when you look up and down the lineup, there are 2 people who have handled Kevin Gausman really well in their careers to the tune of like 375 and then well over 400 in some small sample sizes, but that is Lindor and Soto. Everybody else in the Mets lineup and projected lineup either has no at-bats against Gausman, some of the rookies, obviously Benj, Ewing, or, and again, in a small sample size, they don't have any hits. So I just think this is one of those games, even though we just saw one of those games, where you might see a 2-0 win, maybe a 2-1 win. If you're rooting for the Mets, maybe it goes 2-1 the other way. But if you've got a little fun money to throw around, I think 13 cents a trade for the under is exceptional value. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there is no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy into and out of your position. You already know, but for a limited time, use the code FANARCHBASEBALL on the Kalshi app to get $10 when you trade 10 Kalshi. Trade on anything. Must be 18 and over. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risks and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. Look, this is the part of the show that pains me in some ways. This is the negative side of the show. The quote-unquote baby Mets have been a failure. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about how I felt Francisco Alvarez doesn't deserve to be lumped in with especially Beatty and Vientos, but also to a lesser extent Ronnie Mauricio. And some of that is just because Ronnie Mauricio just hasn't been on the field enough. And I don't think he's good, and I don't think he's going to have some kind of massive career at this point. But just to be fair, the guy has not played a lot. So we could say the jury is sort of, kind of, maybe still out. And I stand by that. I think that Francisco Alvarez, because of his positional value, because he came up so young, because of the learning curve on catchers, I want to grade him on a curve. That's my prerogative to do so. You may disagree, and that's fine, but I will not dispute that Francisco Alvarez has not lived up to the hype. He has underperformed. But I said on yesterday's show, there's a difference between underperforming and unperforming, not performing at all. And Beatty and Vientos have not performed at all. Ronnie Mauricio, when given his opportunities, has either really not performed at all, or, like we saw earlier this season, got hurt near immediately when he was going to be given a 2-month runway to see if he could be a contributor at the major league level, playing a position, shortstop, that he's most comfortable with, despite the fact that he's not a great shortstop, but maybe one where you would say, okay, Ronnie, you don't have to worry about playing another spot, even though Ronnie's better at third, and Ronnie's probably better at second. I think third base is Ronnie Mauricio's best position. but you don't have to worry about playing somewhere else. You play where you've played your whole life. You go out there and you do your thing. Well, he didn't even, I think he was on the field for like 2 or 3 games after Lindor got hurt before he also got hurt. And then they got back on effectively the same day. So all of these guys have provided little to no value. And this crop of prospects, and I use the term prospects kind of loosely as a catch-all here because not all of these players are necessarily even prospects in the truest sense of the word. Francisco Alvarez was a top prospect. He was the Mets' top prospect. He was one of the irrefutable, undisputed top 10 prospects in Major League Baseball. Some lists had him at number 1 in terms of top prospect in the sport. So he was a legit prospect. Brett Baty, a little less so. I think he's more in the top 25 range, but fine. Mark Vientos, not really a prospect, never really a prospect, was a byproduct of the fact that he had power and the Mets system wasn't great. And then Ronnie Mauricio kind of made his way onto some top 100 lists after sort of fading into obscurity and then having a good season in the minors and forcing his way back. So Vientos and Mauricio, not really prospects, but the other two, top prospects in the truest sense of the word. And those 4 guys not succeeding has been a huge part of the reason why the Mets are where they are in 2026. Because, and I tweeted this the other day, I stand by this as well. David Stearns is going to get criticism for who he decided to move on from. Whether right or wrong, fair or unfair, he is going to get that criticism for moving on from Alonso and Nimmo, and probably to a lesser extent Jeff McNeil, and for the debacle, whatever happened with Edwin Diaz, despite the off-the-field stuff, just look at the player. He's going to get criticism for that, and he deserves that. He's also going to get criticism for some of the people that he brought in to replace those players. And again, whether I agree or disagree, whether I trusted the process or didn't understand the process, he deserves that criticism because it hasn't worked. But I think the biggest sin that David Stearns committed that not enough people are talking about are the players that he kept. Now, some of them have been frustrating, but you understand why. Sean Manaea was rewarded with a contract after becoming the ace of the Mets. I didn't like that contract when they gave it to him. I didn't think he'd be as bad as he was last year. I didn't think he'd fall off a cliff, but I never thought he'd be as good as he was in 2024 again. But I understood why the Mets gave him that deal. They rewarded a player who nearly took them everywhere they wanted to go. They rewarded a player who looked like maybe he had turned a corner and found something later in his career, which left-handed pitchers, left-handed starters do often historically in Major League Baseball. And despite the fact that people say, oh, David Stearns, he just goes dumpster diving for starting pitching. Well, yeah, maybe in the 23 offseason for 2024, that's what he did when he signed Sean Manaea to a $10 million deal. But then he doubled down and he rewarded Manaea. He gave Manaea top flight pitching money. Not overall long term, but $25 million a year is nothing to sneeze at. So a guy like him, after 2025, he was going to be unmovable. So I don't mean keeping a guy like him, because you kind of had no choice. After you give him the contract that doesn't work out, you kind of have to stick with it and just see what happens and hope that he can rebound. And after a pretty bad start to the season, he has rebounded a little bit. And maybe that means with 1 year left on his deal, you could trade him. Maybe that means with, in the offseason or whatever. I don't know. But I don't mean someone like him. I mean the players that they identified and said, this player making league minimum or in arbitration is a value player for us in 2026 and probably in 2027. And that's Brett Beatty, and that's Mark Vientos, and that's Francisco Alvarez, and that's, to a lesser extent, Ronnie Mauricio. And those guys have not done enough. Alvarez has not done enough. Mauricio hasn't been around to do enough or anything, really. And the other two have been differently, but so brutally bad that they each provide in their own way negative value. Now, people will tell me because of the defense, you can't lump Beatty and Vientos together. Fine, whatever, sure. I lump them together because Beatty is such a negative offensively that anything he does defensively is almost completely negated. And Vientos, you know how I feel about him. But that's why the Mets find themselves where they are. Yes. Did they need more from Freddie Peralta? Sure. Did they need more from Bo Bichette? Yes. Did they need more from player X, player Y? Could someone have gotten them out of that 12-game losing streak if Devin Williams doesn't blow a game here or there, despite the fact that he's been really good outside of 2 bad outings? Or Luke Weaver decided to not be good for basically the only point in the season so far during that stretch and cost them a game here? Sure, it takes a village to be this bad. But the Mets identifying, let's just say 3 players, and leave Mauricio outside of it because he really didn't have a role on this team to start 2026. The Mets identified Vientos and Beatty and Alvarez as contributors. And when I say contributors, I don't mean like sometimes. I mean some combination, 2 of those guys at minimum, expected to be in the lineup every day. And they've provided nothing. The baby Mets is a failed experiment. If I had my druthers, I would move on from 3 of them. I don't know what it would take to move on from them. It seems like now the Mets are giving Vientos more of an opportunity at third base. Gee, I wonder why. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's because they want to try to trade him, guys. They're not going to get anything back, but they want to show other teams, hey, look, Vientos can play third. We know he can't. But that's the goal here. That's the end game. So I don't know what it's going to take to move away from these guys. I told you I would cut Vientos. I'd DFA him. I would DFA Brett Beatty, although I don't think you have to. I think you could trade Brett Beatty somewhere. I don't know why. I've never seen what other people see in Brett Beatty, so I admit my bias there. But those 2 guys are useless to me. And Ronnie Mauricio, I think, is just a guy now that he's about to be out of options and all that stuff. Like, I just think, too bad, so sad. The Mets decided at the end of last year to preserve Mauricio's option, and they burned Luis Angel Acuña's option. Well, it looks like Acuña's not going to be anything, and they made the right choice. But at the same time, it looks like there was no real right answer, because it looks like they're going to find themselves this season in the same spot that they were in last season with Acuña, and they're just going to have to trade Mauricio for something. And again, you might be able to get something for him. Nothing great, but something. And we'll see. Lastly, I want to talk about the guy who just cannot stop talking, and that is Eric Chavez. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on Eric Chavez because I don't like Eric Chavez. I think Eric Chavez is a dinosaur. I think Eric Chavez is arrogant. I think Eric Chavez has an entitlement about him that he also projects on other people. And I don't like his philosophies on hitting. I don't like his approach. And I don't like the way he's handled things since he left the Mets. I think what he said on his EC3 podcast, and that's not a plug, that's the name of it, and it's a stupid name. I think what he said on his podcast is ridiculous, and I think it's embarrassing. And there's a lot of people in the Mets landscape, there's a lot of people on Mets Twitter that are taking these clips and they're like, ooh, see, I told you. I told you. Stearns is this. The Mets organization is that. Look, we know as Mets fans what the Mets organization is. It's not good. It had an opportunity to be better. It had an opportunity to move past LOL Mets. It had an opportunity to put that stuff in the rearview mirror when Cohen bought the team. And then shortly thereafter, once Stearns took over at the front office. But it hasn't. In some ways, it's been as bad. And in some ways, I don't know if it is, but damn, it feels worse. It feels like LOL Mets is back with a vengeance. My point is, if you've been a Mets fan for a long time, you know how bad this organization can be. So whether that person is Eric Chavez or that person is Mets fan 898691487 on Twitter, people saying David Stearns ruined the Mets. What was there to ruin? This is not some organization that has been the pillar of success and sustainability. I know that. You know that. You've been here a long time. So, and that's not to apologize for Stearns. It's just this narrative that any one man could dismantle this line of kings that the Mets have. This is not Rome. This is not the Greek Empire that you're talking about here. It's the New York Mets. David Stearns cannot single-handedly, unilaterally dismantle this team. This team has been dismantling itself for decades. So this idea that anybody would put out there, or that anybody would buy into when a guy like Eric Chavez puts it out there, that there's some kind of destruction happening right before our very eyes, baby, it's been happening for a lot longer. And I'll say this about Chavez in particular. He also made the rounds on foul territory, but he's been doing this since he got let go. There's an old adage that there are three sides to the story, right? Your side, my side, and the truth. So I'm sure that there is some truth in what Eric Chavez is saying. I'm sure that there are through lines of accuracy. I don't know the man. I don't know that he's some kind of liar, and I'm not calling him one. But I do think that his opinion is very, very, very biased in one direction. And I think he's going to go out of his way to make sure that certain people look good and certain other people, namely David Stearns, looks bad. And guys, you don't have to go that far to figure that out. Look, your ability to do some critical thinking here and not just agree with something that fits your narrative, not just put yourself in an echo chamber, not just turn off the part of your brain that has, media literacy because you like what somebody's saying because, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So look at this for what it is. Eric Chavez and David Stearns are philosophically, diametrically opposed in how they want to approach a baseball team, how they think a baseball team should be built and should be operated and should be run. We know that because we have a track record of both individuals, albeit in different jobs, but both individuals have worked in Major League Baseball for a long time. One on the coaching side, one in the front office side. We understand a little bit about what their philosophies entail. And they are different. And now remember, David Stearns fired Eric Chavez. David Stearns also fired some coaches that Eric Chavez had been around a long time, had been with a long time. David Stearns also fired Buck Showalter. Or I guess maybe Steve Cohen whatever. The bottom line is David Stearns came in, and then it was an organizational decision that Showalter was going to be out and the Mets were going to go in a different direction. So this is a situation where there's some sour grapes here. You don't have to dig too far to find the logic in why this has been a smear campaign. Now, again, this is not, and I repeat, because people said this to me on Twitter, this is not a defense of David Stearns. David Stearns deserves plenty of criticism, for sure. Keep it on. But don't allow yourself to be fooled into falling into some echo chamber because a guy is saying something you like and that fits your narrative. You're better than that, guys. Use a little bit of critical thinking and understand where and why Eric Chavez, where he's coming from, and why he's saying what he's saying. He doesn't like David Stearns. Period. Again, that's his prerogative. He can do that. And you can choose to not like David Stearns either. So you could like what Eric Chavez is saying. I'm not telling you how to feel about it. You can feel however you want, but just know where it's coming from. You, more than likely, anybody watching this, you, like me, you don't know David Stearns. You never worked for David Stearns. David Stearns never fired you. Eric Chavez has an axe to grind. Eric Chavez is also doing something that a lot of people in his position probably wouldn't do, which is being so public, so outward, so outspoken. And I guess in that sense, you kind of have to respect it. But the thing is, he can afford to, literally. Eric Chavez made a lot of money as a player. You know, he was a very, very good player for a long time. And so he doesn't necessarily need to work in baseball again. And he's operating like somebody who doesn't care if he does. Quite frankly. Now, some of you are going to say, John, David Stearns doesn't have that kind of power. Obviously, David Stearns doesn't have that kind of power. But organizations look at what people say and do and how people are treated. And if you've got a guy who leaves a job that he was in for a long time and he can't stop word vomiting and airing all the dirty laundry, that's not a guy that other places are going to be quick to hire. And the last thing I'll say about this is, even by his own arguments, this is Chavez, can't keep his story straight. And what I mean by that is he can't keep who he wants to give credit to straight. So in one breath, he says, well, the players who left are doing better because they're away from David Stearns. You know, Pete Alonso, it was stupid to let him go, and look how good he's doing, and he's thriving in a different place. Okay, not exactly true, but whatever. And also, I'm paraphrasing. Okay. But then also, he made a point to bring up the coaches that left. Antoine Richardson, Jeremy Hefner, and how good they're doing. Well, are they doing well in Atlanta because Atlanta has better players? Or are they getting better out of the players? He can't keep it straight. So the one common denominator here in his entire argument, and this is why it's disingenuous, and this is why you have to look at it through a critical lens, the one common denominator in everything that Eric Chavez is saying is David Stearns bad. Everything else, good. Pete Alonso, he's great. Jeremy Hefner, he's great. Carlos Mendoza, he's great. These guys, none of them can do any wrong. He looks at himself, Chavez. Me, Eric Chavez, I'm great. Nobody can do any wrong. David Stearns, bad. So when you look at it that way, again, you just have to understand where this is coming from. And I think that that's not only a good idea for this specific situation, but dare I say it, you guys, this is just a baseball show, and I'm just a guy who likes the New York Mets and likes to talk on the microphone with all of you. But I think that might be a good way to go about life. Read a little deeper. You got the critical thinking. Look past it. Somebody out there saying some stuff that you like, you can like it, but just understand why they're saying it. And in this case, Eric Chavez isn't on your side. Eric Chavez doesn't know you. He knows David Stearns, and he knows he doesn't like him. And that's what this has become. And for the love of God, don't listen to Eric Chavez on his EC3 podcast. Listen to Mets Daily, because you're a New York Mets fan. And Eric Chavez isn't here anymore. But I'm here with you 5 days a week, sometimes more. But in all seriousness, that's going to do it for this episode of Mets Daily. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, sitting at just over 4,000 subscribers, trying to get to 5,000 before the season is over. We would love to do that, but more importantly, we would love for you to be a part of it. Until next time, I'm John Saponaro. See you tomorrow.